During the time period of early 1500s to early 1600s, the general roles as we know it were already forming. When Columbus and many other explorers alike began their voyages in hope of finding wealth and prosperity, they directly affected the way gender roles changed throughout the time of economic growth. When explorers like the Spanish, French, and English came to the New World, they adopted different techniques of acquiring the power they were striving for. At this time, when the English came to the New World, they were exclusionary of natives, meaning they brought their own families and workers and essentially excluded Native Americans. Women were seen as sex objects, and this stereotype of women took a very long time to be erased. They were also excluded from the Civil War and weren't given as many options as men were. In Unit 2, we discussed the practicality of slavery and the pros and cons that it offered. There were debates between the North and South whether it should be abolished or not, and how it would affect the prices of cotton and tobacco products. African American families at this time had children who would grow up in slavery. Generally, the men would do the manual labor on the farm while the woman would stay inside and take care of the family by doing things such as watch over the children or keep the house tidy. Gender roles during the time period of the late 1700s and early 1800s highlighted the difference between men and women. Letters between Abigail Adams and John Adams had a general outline of what the gender roles looked like. Abigail Adams was trying to convince John Adams to push for women's rights and equality, and at this time he wasn't taking her seriously, but instead laughing at her request by calling her saucy. Later on, Lowell Mill was a huge deal because it was the first place to provide schooling and employment opportunities for women. Lowell Mill was absolutely revolutionary in the push for gender equality because women for the first time were able to work and take care of themselves. In Unit 5, we discussed the increase in prostitution. There was a big shift in society at this time to get money, and women became prostitutes to participate in this money-making process. The gap between poor and rich was caused by a huge increase in the middle class, which allowed women to find jobs much easier than before because of the increase in production. With this increase in the middle class, more women's activists such as Jane Addams began to force gender equality. World War I and World War II completely changed the way the United States felt towards women taking on more responsibility and working to keep the nation afloat. By this time, there was a massive increase in propaganda encouraging women to start working. This is extremely important because when the men went off to war, there was no one to continue production, so they had women take their jobs to produce war materials and weapons to keep the troops alive. After World War II was over, women lost their jobs and the men were given their jobs back. This showed that men were still dominant, but after World War II this changed. After World War II had ended, mass propaganda struck the workplace urging women to get back to the home, but they had much more respect and a greater role because they were the ones who won the war. Within the past 60 years or so, there has been an astronomical spike in the female workforce. This has happened because of the civil rights movement. These two forces work collectively and create an equal environment for everyone, not just in the rulebooks. This is such a memorable movement because the amount of people who participated and the impact it had on society. Some of the gender roles have even flipped. For example, the film Rebel Without a Cause showed the 1950s conformity. When Jim criticizes his father for not being manly enough, it shows the reverse gender stereotypes. This scene also points out that it is good for women to perform men's jobs, but it is not good for a man to perform a woman's job, and many of these ideals and gender stereotypes are very common today. When explorers visited the New World, it was almost an obsession to record everything. In the Iroquois creation story, it showed the play of myths and the story of keeping records. The white man's obsession with money, or in this case gold, determined their path for destruction. By raiding native villages and stealing sacred land from Native Americans, they made a memorable impact for policymakers ahead. This frustration between the whites and Native Americans essentially led to the Indian War period. Mercantilism and many other acts were passed to restrict the sale and use of certain items. The Hat, Wool, and Iron Acts prevented colonists from selling those specific commodities without question. Mercantilism and solitary neglect basically kept the New World obedient to the British. The Navigation Acts were a big punch in the gut to the colonists because it was a restriction on shipments going into or out of the United States. This increased tension between the colonists and British hurt the economic ties through events such as the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. These restrictions led to the colonists fighting against Britain's control. In Unit 3, we discussed the power that each president holds and how it affects the future of the nation. Jackson was referred to as a common man because of the way he connected to the public. The increase in industrialization and mechanization boosted the U.S.'s economy and had a positive perspective in the public's eye. Hamilton's fiscal policy was very important in shaping future political responses because it stimulated commerce, manufacturing, made the U.S. as a whole independent economically, and it protected American industry through tariffs. The Mexican-American War was very important at this time. Johnson's impeachment was probably one of the most dramatic events in U.S. history because it was the first impeachment in the U.S. during a time of construction. Lincoln worked to reshape executive power and was very successful, which impacts us today. Other things that weren't so important were the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address because they really only gave those in Confederate territory freedom. But the freedom was limited through Jim Crow laws that were specific to African Americans. In Unit 5, we learned how different laws passed affected not only the United States economy and production, but how they affected the Native Americans as well. The Homestead Act gave land to citizens for very cheap in an attempt to get individual owners to take care and operate their farms instead of Southern slave owners who benefit from groups of slaves doing the work. Many labor unions formed that were meant to benefit the employees as opposed to benefiting the employer. They helped to improve hourly pay and working conditions. The Transcontinental Railroad was very important because it gave us a direct route for transportation of goods during a national emergency, i.e. the Civil War. Half-dollar diplomacy, Wilson's moralism versus realism, and the big stick policy are all examples of how the U.S. changed foreign and domestic policy forever. A great example of how politics shaped the public opinion is the Espionage Act, because it prohibited any interference with military operations, supporting United States enemies, and any interference with military recruitment. These acts and laws that were passed changed foreign affairs and domestic affairs by shaping the public. During the transition between World War I and World War II, and even after World War II, there was a period for politics to shape the public. The Truman Doctrine provided economic and military support to Greece and Turkey to prevent them falling into communism. The Marshall Plan was a program that aided European countries in rebuilding an infrastructure after World War II to prevent the distribution of communism. At home, there was mass propaganda regarding the idea of duck and cover to ensure that we would be ready for an attack with weapons of mass destruction. These are only a small handful of policies, laws, and acts that were passed that ultimately shaped the public.